So here's the short list of representative heroes for today's lecture. We'll finish the career of Bernini in the first half of the program, and in doing that we'll see some of the most spectacular things in Italian Baroque art, including the Cornaro Chapel, the Four Rivers Fountain, and St. Peter's. Then we'll hear about France and Louis XIV's day, and in doing that we'll see some of the most spectacular things in French Baroque art, including the chateaux of Vaux-le-Vicomte and Versailles. And we'll also hear about Molière, arguably the greatest French dramatist of the age, and Jean-Baptiste Lully, the one-time Italian scullery boy who became the musical dictator of Paris. To return to the career of Gian-Lorenzo Bernini, then, this is a portrait bust which he did of his mistress, Costanza Bonarelli, and it has a good deal of the vitality that's always said to be characteristic of his best portraits, like the one we saw last time of Scipione Borghese. And Costanza was a vital and violent woman. She was, in fact, the wife of one of his assistants, and also had an affair with his brother. On one occasion, she tried to kill Bernini himself, and in revenge, he sent a hitman to cut her face with a razor and threw this bust out in the street, or gave it away, depending on which sources you believe. Whatever he did with it, it has since found its way to the Bargello in Florence. Since Bernini was a close friend of the Pope, Urban VIII, and this sort of behavior by a friend was a bit embarrassing to His Holiness, the latter is said to have put pressure on his resident creative genius to get married and settle down. This is a self-portrait sketch by Bernini now, although done somewhat earlier in his career. Bernini, though about 40, was still by that time not anxious to get married, but one day, according to legend at least, he just went out on the street and looked up and down till he saw a girl he liked, went up to her and said, "Buongiorno. I'm Gian-Lorenzo Bernini. I'm the Pope's best friend. I'm rich. I'm handsome. I'm a genius. Will you marry me?" And of course she said yes. Her name was Caterina Tezio. We don't know a lot about her, but Bernini seems to have in fact settled down. They had 11 children, 9 of whom reached adulthood. There's some inconsistency in accounts of where Bernini lived in Rome. He apparently lived early in his career in a house on the Corso. Then some say he moved here to the Piazza Santa Maria Maggiore and lived in the house more or less in the center of this picture. It has a plaque on the wall saying he lived here anyway, although he also apparently lived for a time near the Spanish Steps. I think it's at least likely he was living in this house we see here at the end of his life, because he was buried in Santa Maria Maggiore. In any case, when Urban died in 1644, he was succeeded by Innocent X Pamphilii, whom we see here in the famous portrait by Velázquez, which is still owned by the Pamphilii family in Rome. Innocent had been no admirer of Urban VIII. For one thing, Urban had been more friendly to the French in the 30 Years' War than Innocent liked, while the latter had supported the Spanish and the Habsburgs. For another, he didn't like Urban's financial policy. Innocent looks here as though he might have just seen the Vatican bank account, most of which Urban had spent, or perhaps he's just been informed that the bell towers, which Bernini, whom Urban had named architect of St. Peter's, had tried to put on the facade of the church, were going to have to be pulled down because they were unstable. The bell tower project was to be Bernini's most, really only conspicuous failure, much to the delight of Francesco Borromini, his quondam associate. The connection between Bernini and Urban, combined with the bell tower debacle, meant that Innocent wasn't going to give Bernini anything new to do for some time, although he did allow him to remain on as architect of the Church of St. Peter's. You don't need to feel sorry for Bernini, however, because he had plenty of other work, and many think his most impressive accomplishment as an artist was, in fact, undertaken during this period. This is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the Cornaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. The subject is the most famous passage in the autobiography of Saint Teresa, in which she describes a beautiful angel appearing to her in the way Bernini has very literally represented. I'll just refer you to the passage itself if you want the description of the event in her own words, but suffice it to say that both the passage and Bernini's representation of it have been subjected to a lot of psychoanalysis. Some think her description of the event sounds like a description of something else altogether. Photographs can't really do justice to the whole project here. To each side are what look for all the world like box seats in a theater, with members of the Cornaro family in them gesturing and talking, just as though they might in fact be at an opera or something. Here you see up closer what one commentator has called the smoldering core of the whole ensemble. Bernini himself called it his most beautiful work, but the combination of spirituality and sensuality appalled many later critics. I mentioned earlier that many now regard Borromini as a greater architect than Bernini, and he certainly regarded himself that way. They collaborated on several projects, including the Palazzo Barberini in St. Peter's, but Borromini left the latter in 1633 to work as an independent architect with the blessing and recommendation of Bernini himself. The Church of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane is one of his most original buildings, and was in fact built to serve the Roman branch of the Discalced Carmelites, the order founded by St. Teresa. The undulating facade is the first thing one sees, of course, and pretty much no other church in the history of Christianity had ever had such a thing. There is, in fact, hardly a straight line in the ground plan of the church either, and some see this emphasis on curvilinearity as sort of the architectural equivalent to Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. The curves give the church a kind of voluptuous quality. The building becomes in its own way then a combination of spirituality and sensuality. Nicholas Pevsner, the foremost historian of European architecture, even says it reminds him of the naked human form. For heaven's sake. Here's the interior now. It's a small church, so it's difficult, as with the Cornaro Chapel, to convey the look of the whole thing in a photo, but the church is built using ovals rather than rectilinear geometry as its basis, and Borromini left little space except at the altars themselves for any painting to spoil what he regarded as the purity of his architectural design. Sant'Ivo, the Chapel of the Sapienza, the University of Rome, is another of Borromini's distinctive churches, this time with a concave facade topped by an undulating dome that is actually very similar in shape to the Church of San Carlo we just saw, although on a smaller scale. This church was begun when Urban VIII was still Pope, but it is decorated with the star of the Chigi Pope Alexander VII, during whose papacy the decoration was completed. Inside, you can see the Chigi star again decorating the dome, along with the family coat of arms. The whole dome, in fact, is essentially star-shaped, as is the ground plan of the church, which is a little puzzling because it was apparently built, if not decorated, before Alexander VII took over. It's hard to believe this was just a coincidence. The Palazzo Pamphilii, one of several palazzi the family once owned, is also mostly the work of Borromini, although it is not as apparently original as the two churches we've seen. The Church of San Agnese, also by Borromini, is next to it on the right, and we'll get a better look at it in a bit. This palazzo is now the Brazilian embassy. Borromini continued to get many commissions into his old age, but as I mentioned, he never felt he got the respect he deserved and committed suicide at the age of 68. Members of the Pamphilii family still own the Palazzo Doria Pamphilii in downtown Rome, where the Doria Pamphilii collection is, and until 1957 they also owned the Villa Doria Pamphilii, which you see now south of Vatican City. This was built for Innocent X's nephew, Camillo Pamphilii, beginning about 1650 by Alessandro Algardi, an architect and sculptor not far below Borromini and Bernini in ability, and who, like Borromini received some commissions from Innocent's family that might otherwise have gone to Bernini himself. This is Algardi's portrait of the Pope's sister-in-law, Olympia Medalchini, and you can judge from this why many thought him every bit as good a sculptor as Bernini. Olympia does not have a good reputation. She is said to have meddled in religious and political affairs and to have used her influence over Innocent X to generally bad effect, but she was, despite the fact that this was made by Algardi, a great admirer of Bernini. The story goes that when Innocent decided to order a big fountain project to decorate the Piazza Navona, the front yard, as it were, of the Palazzo Pamphilii, he invited all the designers in Rome except Bernini to submit models and plans for what they would do. Olympia told Bernini to make a model anyway and she would smuggle it into the competition. Some say it was Niccolo Ludovisi, the husband of the Pope's niece, who brought Bernini's model to the Pope's attention, but in any case, someone did. Here you see the Piazza Navona with the Palazzo Pamphilii in San Agnese, the palace and church which Borromini built for the Pamphilii on the left. Come Judgment Day for the competition, as it were, what we have to imagine is the Pope walking by the models displayed, none of them really catching his eye until he suddenly saw one that stopped him in his tracks. Ecco, ecco, he said, that's the one. Whose model is this? And of course it was Bernini's. When told this, the Pope remarked, I can only resist his work when I can't see it, and Bernini got the job. In something like this way, at least. In the picture, you can see the famous Four Rivers fountain with the obelisk on top of it in the center of the piazza. The fountain at the north end, beyond it, is 19th century, but the one in the foreground was also done under Bernini's direction. But as I mentioned earlier, by this point in his career, he was more a designer rather than a hands-on sculptor of projects like these. Innocent had stipulated that the obelisk be included in the design. It had been found on property the family owned south of the city and was apparently brought to Italy in Vespasian's day, the 1st century AD. It was an awkward requirement to include, but I suppose Bernini's scheme made at least as good use of it as any of the other ideas. Here's the project up closer now. The original idea to use four rivers representing the four quarters of the earth seems to have come from Borromini, but exactly how he planned to depict them we don't know. But the fact that it was in the end Bernini who got the job here must have been just one more thing to drive the former closer to his eventual suicide. The rivers are the Ganges, which we see on this side, the Danube on the left here, the Nile on the right, and the Plata on the opposite side, the side opposite the Ganges. This work has had its critics. One referred to it as art for plumbers, and Bernini himself is said to have come to dislike it, but it is now considered so much a part of the Roman scene and personality that criticism of its aesthetic quality seems almost irrelevant. Innocent himself was certainly satisfied. When the water was first turned on, he said the sight of it added 10 years to his life. On the other side now, you can see La Plata at the left representing the Americas and the Danube at the right representing Europe. The fountain is, of course, right in front of San Agnese, the Pamphilii family church, which was built by Borromini and where Innocent X himself is buried. If you come around behind La Plata, you can see the curvilinear facade of the church in Borromini's typical style, and it is said that Bernini arranged La Plata in such a way as to make it seem as though he is shielding his eyes from the sight of it, but I doubt that this was Bernini's intent. Almost all of the animosity in the relationship seems to have come from Borromini, and as far as I know, Bernini never publicly said anything bad about him, despite considerable provocation and despite Bernini's own prickly character and occasionally explosive temper. Here's the Nile, which has his head covered, indicating that his source or headwaters were as yet undiscovered. As I said, Bernini did little, if any, of the actual carving here, but some think that he may have been personally responsible for some work on the Nile figure, and also on this horse, though evidence for this is pretty insubstantial. With Bernini back in favor with the Pamphilii, the Pope's brother commissioned him to build this church for the Jesuits across the Via Quirinale from the Palazzo Quirinale. This church is now popular for weddings in the diplomatic corps and high society generally, and usually has several BMWs or Mercedes-Benzes parked in front of it. The most remarkable thing about the interior is that, like Borromini's Church of San Carlo just down the street, the ground plan is based on an oval, but the short axis is from west to east. The distance from the entrance to the altar is shorter than that from one side of the church to the other, and this is essentially unprecedented in European church building. Like San Carlo, too, this is a small church, so it's difficult to convey the effect of this in a photograph. The altar area is given over to the kind of multimedia conception we've seen in the Barberini Palazzo in Il Gesù. St. Andrew is martyred on his X-shaped cross in the painting over the altar, and then rises as a marble sculpture into the architectural firmament above. The figure of the saint was made by Antonio Raggi, who was one of Bernini's most talented assistants and who also made the figure representing the Danube in the Four Rivers Fountain. In 1655, Innocent X died and was succeeded by Alexander VII Chigi, whom you see here in the funeral monument designed for him by Bernini in St. Peter's. Alexander was a fervent Catholic, opposed to all compromise with Protestants anywhere. And though a soi-disant poet, he was of a generally gloomy and morbid disposition. He is said to have slept in a coffin to keep death in mind, and drank from a cup made in the form of a skull. The fact that the monument had to be placed above a door was a challenge Bernini dealt with by, in effect, having it represent the door to death, from which a skeleton emerges, waggling an hourglass as a memento mori, the conception exactly to Alexander's taste. Like the Borgheses, the Barberinis, and the Pamphilii, the Chigis had a big house in Rome, which you see now, the Palazzo Chigi on the Piazza Colonna. This was actually begun for the Aldobrandini family by Giacomo della Porta and finished by Carlo Maderno, but it was bought by the Chigis and is now the residence of the Italian Prime Minister. The elephant with the obelisk in front of the Church of Santa Maria Sopra Minerva in Rome would probably qualify as the cutest of Bernini's projects. It was commissioned by Alexander VII to display the obelisk, which had been found on the grounds of the church, which itself had been built over a temple dedicated to Minerva, which had been built over a temple to Isis. The obelisk itself is from the 6th century BC. Bernini was connected with several much bigger projects in Alexander VII's day, too. Here's an aerial view of the Quirinal Hill, with the Quirinal Palace and its gardens in the center. A lot of architects worked on this project, beginning with Flavio Panzio in the 1570s, and including Maderno and Bernini, and the latter was essentially the overseer of the construction of the Manica Lunga, the long sleeve, as it's called, along the Via Quirinale to the southeast of the palace, to the right of it in this picture. It's across the street, the palace, as I mentioned earlier, from San Andrea al Quirinale, which we saw a few minutes ago. This big palace was frequently the residence of the popes until the unification of Italy in 1870, and it is now the Italian White House, the residence of the Italian president, but it could house about half the population of Rome, it looks like, and I don't really know what goes on in most of it. It makes the Washington White House look like a cottage. Here's the facade on the square. The entrance is sometimes credited to Bernini, though more often to Maderno. In any case, it makes a memorable contrast with the rest of the building. It has the theatrical quality of the Baroque, and the rest of the facade has much more of the serenity of the Renaissance. Bernini also remodeled the Porta del Popolo at the north end of the Corso for Alexander VII. You can see the Chigi star on top of it there. This was traditionally viewed as the official gateway into the city from the north, and the bulk of the thing itself is part of the Aurelian Wall, put up way back in the 3rd century AD. If your great-great-great-great-grandparents made the grand tour back in the 18th or 19th centuries, chances are they entered the city through this gate. Looking back the other way from the gate, you can see the twin churches of Santa Maria in Monte Santo and Santa Maria de Miracoli on either side of the entrance to the Corso that has been the main road into the heart of Rome since Julius Caesar's day and before. Laid down over the Flaminian Way, it leads straight to the Forum. These churches were the work of several architects, including Carlo Rinaldi, Carlo Fontana, and Bernini himself. Sant'Andrea del Valle is another church built in Bernini's day, though he was not one of the architects. The three Carlos, Maderno, Rinaldi, and Fontana were involved with it, and the dome is the highest of any church in the city of Rome, but the highest dome in the whole neighborhood is, of course, across the river in Vatican City. We heard in the Italian Renaissance class, of course, about how the rebuilding of the old Constantinian Basilica put up over the presumed tomb of St. Peter was undertaken in Julius II's day by Bramante, and about the succession of architects who followed him, including Raphael, San Gallo, Michelangelo, Della Porta, and Maderno. Paul V Borghese, whose portrait by Bernini we saw last time, commissioned Maderno to lengthen the east wing of what had been intended by the earlier architects to be a Greek cross-shaped church with 4 equal arms dominated by a dome. This made the church bigger, but the dome is no longer a dominating feature at ground level as it was meant to be. The 300-foot-long, 150-foot-high facade, which Maderno erected with Paul's name on it, obscures the rest of the church until you're about a quarter of a mile or so away from it. Bernini was appointed to succeed Maderno in 1629 by Urban VIII, and although the building itself was essentially finished by that time, he was responsible for most of the interior decoration and for the design of the piazza in front of the church, undertaken in Alexander VII's pontificate. Even at this distance, the dome is still not completely visible. Bernini's factory produced 284 40-foot-high columns for the colonnades and 90 12-foot-high statues to decorate them. And then there are the 20-foot-high statues of Christ, John the Baptist, and the Apostles on the roof. Every sculptor and stone carver in Rome who could hold a chisel must have been involved in this work. Incidentally, I'm not making a mistake in referring to this as the east end of the church. The altar here is at the west end, as it was in the original church, and as it is in some of the other churches in the city which were established very early, like St. John Lateran and Santa Maria Maggiore, before the decision was made to change the orientation of Christian churches, in part to distinguish them from pagan temples, which typically had their altars at the west end. The The statues and columns are travertine rather than marble, so they have weathered considerably and look it up close, but there isn't that much that can be done about this, and in 500 years they'll just be nubs of stone, I'm afraid. Art historians don't worry as much as you might suppose at this prospect, however. Since the statues are not generally considered great individual works of art, these are the ones on the facade. One of the statues done for St. Peter's, though, is apparently, at least to a large extent, by Bernini's own hand, the colossal Constantine at the north end of the entrance portico of the church. This is another work that illustrates the use of the Baroque moment, catching the figure at the most crucial moment of the event and stopping the action right there. Constantine has just seen the flaming cross in the sky. He's just been told in hoc signo vinces, by this sign thou shalt conquer, and he then went on to win the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against the pagan would-be Emperor Maximian in 312. And then he made Christianity legal for the first time by the Edict of Milan the next year. He also sponsored the building of the original St. Peter, so there are several reasons to honor him here. Bernini also designed the Scala Regia, the passageway which allows access from the papal palace to the portico of the church, which it enters where the statue of Constantine is. You can see the Chigi star on the floor in the distance. It was again Alexander VII who commissioned this project. And here's the portico, which is bigger than most churches all by itself. It's essentially the work of Maderno as far as the architecture goes, but Bernini designed the floor, and much of the decoration of the interior of the church was also done under his administration. The baldacchino over the high altar and the Cathedra Pietri, the throne of St. Peter, are the most spectacular parts of this, but he also designed the floor of the church itself, the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, the decoration of several other chapels and tombs, including Alexander VII, which we saw, and those of Urban VIII and Matilda, the 11th century Countess of Tuscany, and the statues in the niches around the baldacchino, one of which, that of Longinus, the Roman centurion who recognized Jesus as the Savior at the time of the crucifixion, was again probably made mostly by Bernini himself. We'll go inside now to see a lot of this, and while we do so, we'll hear Frescobaldi's Toccata in D minor in Canzon Prima. So here's the nave now with the 90-foot-high bronze baldacchino over the altar in the distance. And here it is up closer. The serpentine columns are always considered perfectly Baroque, but several columns from the 4th century basilica were used in the decoration of the new church here, and they're also twisted like this. You can see one in the balcony at the upper right. Here's Bernini's Longinus, stopped at the very moment of his revelation, at the Baroque moment. And beyond the baldacchino is the Cathedra Pietri, the symbolic throne of St. Peter, with 4 great doctors of the church in attendance, Ambrose and Augustine representing the West, and Athanasius and St. John Chrysostomus representing the East. And here's St. Augustine up closer. The figures are about 20 feet high. And this is the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, the last thing Bernini completed for the church. And the dome now, 450 feet high. This is like looking up inside the Great Pyramid. In 1665, Bernini went to Paris to work for Louis XIV, and in a while we'll see what he did for him, but this is a portrait of Louis at just the age of 10 by a fellow named Testelin. You should remember that his parents, Louis XIV's parents, were Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, and he inherited the title when he was still just 4 years old, with his mother as regent. His childhood was something like his father's. He was neglected by his mother and nearly drowned when the servants appointed to watch him neglected him as well. This is Anne, his mother, whose portrait we saw earlier by Rubens. This is by the Frenchman Nocret, but she doesn't look any better, I'm afraid. She made enemies among the nobility for relying on Cardinal Mazarin for advice instead of on them, and there's some evidence they were lovers. In any case, the rumor that the queen was the mistress of Mazarin, a man whose father was a Sicilian peasant, didn't make her position any better, certainly. And this is a portrait of Mazarin now by Mignard. Mazarin was born Giulio Mazzarini in Italy. In his youth, he traveled to Spain with a relative and attended the University of Alcalá, which gave him fluency in Spanish, which was to prove very useful both after he entered the diplomatic service of the papacy and at the French court during the regency of Anne of Austria, whose native language was Spanish. He met Richelieu while he was on diplomatic business in Paris in 1630 and was very much impressed. And during the 30 Years' War, then, he supported the French position at the Vatican and returned to Paris to become a French citizen in 1639. After the death of Richelieu, he became the chief advisor to Louis XIII, and then, as I mentioned, to his widow. In 1648, however, a series of rebellions known as the Fronde broke out, directed at Mazarin's policies, Mazarin himself, and the Queen. The word Fronde means sling in French, and the Frondeurs, as the rebels were called, used slings to throw things at Mazarin and other objects of their displeasure. This is a portrait now of Louis de Bourbon, Duc de Condé, known as the Grand Condé, by Just van Egmont, a Flemish portrait painter who was a pupil of Rubens. We heard earlier about Condé's success over the Spanish at Rocroi, and he felt that that kind of thing entitled him to be a prominent voice at court, despite the fact that by 1648 he was still just 24. The Queen and Mazarin felt otherwise, and had Condé been willing to put himself at the head of a popular rebellion against the government, he might have made himself the king, but he hated common people even more than he hated Mazarin and the Queen. He helped suppress the First Fronde, as that stage of the rebellion's called, but this still didn't impress Mazarin. And Condé finally did join the rebels then, and was able to enter the city after the Battle of the Porte Saint-Antoine in 1652, when Louis XIV's cousin, known as La Grande Mademoiselle, persuaded the people to open the gates to let in his army and shut out the royal one. After a couple of months of chaos, however, Condé fled, and the royal commander, Henri de Turenne, led Louis XIV, Mazarin, and the Queen back into Paris. This is François de la Rochefoucauld, the lover of Condé's sister, and perhaps the most famous casualty of the battle at the Porte Saint-Antoine. He suffered a head wound and retired to his chateau to write his memoirs, which are one of our major first-person sources for the period of the Fronde Rebellion. and also to write his famously wry and acerbic Maxime, which are his real literary claim to fame. This was his home. La Rochefoucauld was a good friend of Madame de Lafayette in his old age, and some people think he helped her write La Princesse de Clèves, often considered the first important novel, by a woman at least, but there's certainly little in common between his maxims and her book. Love, he says, is like the ghost which everyone says exists, but which no one has actually ever seen. He says to refuse praise is to express the desire to be praised twice. There are few virtuous women who do not tire of their role, he says. And one of his most telling epigrams, we all have sufficient strength to support the misfortunes of others. In the center of this picture, you can see the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The building is still there, but the library itself has moved to a new home on the Quai François-Mauriac. The Bibliothèque Nationale was established here in Louis XV's day and today has the third largest collection of books in the world after the Library of Congress and the British Library. Mazarin occupied the original building on the site, but only one part of that survives along the Rue Vivienne to the east. And you see that now. Some parts of the Bibliothèque Nationale do still remain here, including parts of the collection of objets d'art of various kinds, which Mazarin himself put together. And he also left money for the establishment of the Collège des Quatre Nations, the College of the Four Nations, as it was called, the Four Nations being pieces of territory that were added to France more or less during his administration. The building, begun in 1662, was the work of Louis Laveau, about whom we'll hear more shortly. When Bernini arrived in Paris, I think he must have taken a good look at it, because his plan for the east front of the Louvre looks a lot like this, minus the dome. The curved facade might also remind you of Borromini. Napoleon had it taken over for the use of the Institut de France, and it now houses the French Academy and the other agencies that make up the French Institute. Mazarin had three famously beautiful nieces. One became a mistress of Charles II, another became the mother of Eugene of Savoy, and the third, Marie, was the first love of Louis XIV. This is a portrait of Marie Mancini, now by Mignard, or one of his assistants. Louis XIV seems to have wanted to marry her, but Mazarin knew that the nobility would be driven to new fury if the king were to wed the niece of the man so many of them hated, so he reluctantly refused to give his consent. Louis had to make a match of more political significance. He could not marry for so trivial a reason as love, if in fact he did love her. He seems to have gotten over the thing pretty quickly, and she went on to marry an Italian nobleman. In 1659, then, as part of the treaty which ended the war with Spain that had gone on for 11 years, even after the 30 Years' War had ended, Louis married Maria Theresa, the daughter of Philip IV of Spain, and his wife Mariana, and the marriage is the subject of this tapestry. In the center you can see Louis and Philip, whom you should recognize from all the portraits of him by Velázquez we saw. The bride-to-be is at the right, and Mazarin is over Louis' shoulder. Here she is in an anonymous portrait with the Dauphin, the only one of their 6 children to live to adulthood, although Louis long outlived him. She was the second Spanish-born Queen of France in a row. She followed her Aunt Anne of Austria, but that didn't make things any easier for her. By the time of the marriage, her mother-in-law aunt was no longer a factor in the politics of the court, and Maria Theresa did not have the kind of aggressive personality that would have been required for her to be a dominating influence. At the time of the wedding, according to Will Durant, she had spoken to only 2 men in her life, her father and her confessor, and she must not have had much to say to her confessor. The fact that she spoke no French at all when she arrived in Paris also put her at a big disadvantage at a court where the use of language correctly, with all nuances understood, was a sine qua non of social success. Louis himself again about this time by Mignard. Mazarin died in 1661, and he advised Louis to appoint no prime minister to succeed him, but rather to make all his decisions himself. When the members of the court staff asked Louis after Mazarin's death then to whom they should report who would be his prime minister, he is said to have responded with the famous line, "À moi, l'état c'est moi, I am the state." Well, once Louis was married and in control of the government, the first order of business was to find a mistress, and this is a portrait of his first long-term mistress, Louise de la Vallière. Louis met her when she was a teenage lady-in-waiting to Henrietta Anne, the wife of his brother. She was, in fact, probably the most appealing of all his famous mistresses, in personality at least. She was modest, did not try to take advantage of her influential position in any political way, and when Louis became more interested in the Marquise de Montespan, she entered a Carmelite nunnery where she spent the rest of her days in expiation of what she had always considered the sinful life she had led. This is a portrait by Sebastian Bourdon of the man who was Louis's finance minister at the outset of his reign, Nicolas Fouquet, and Louis at one point suspected him of being too friendly with La Vallière. But be that as it may, he does look guilty of something, and we'll hear more about him and see his famous chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, which Thomas Oving has called the finest in France after the break.